Jesus didn't have a problem with people that's in the streets. He had a problem with religious people.
How can I help anybody when I was not even able to help my own son?
I would never do that. I would never do that. And I became that in a matter of minutes when they took my pain pills away.
And I said, I'm not where I want to be, but thank God I'm not what I used to be.
This is Faith in Your Recovery. I am Randy Davis. Welcome to the battle. Once again, thanks for joining us here today for Faith in Your Recovery. We're glad to have you with us. We look forward to what we've got to share, and we just want to invite you to get a hold of us, message us any questions, comments you have during this episode, and please tell a friend we're here. Get them to join you next time. Our guest today is Cathy Scott. Welcome, Cathy.
Thanks so much, Randy, for having me today.
We're thrilled to have you. Go ahead and tell the folks a little about yourself professionally and add some personal info to that as well.
Okay. Professionally, I am a nurse by education and training, and spent my nursing clinical career really in oncology and bone marrow transplant. So that feels pretty far removed for me right now. And in addition to that, I owned a consulting company for about 17 years in which we, pharmacists, physicians, respiratory therapists, myself as a nurse, we did consulting around the state in many, many different kinds of healthcare environments, jails, prisons, long-term care, residential homes, homes for developmentally disabled, and a variety of different kinds of settings. Yeah. So, and what we did was do some survey-type work, although not surveys themselves technically, but survey-type work that would help those settings be able to meet regulatory and quality and patient safety requirements from a physician standpoint, from a medication management standpoint, respiratory therapy, nursing care standpoint. I did that for a number of years and frankly then decided that maybe it was time to work for someone else and not myself. And that took me to Purdue University, which was a fabulous opportunity and step in, at that point in time into the School of Pharmacy, the College of Pharmacy at Purdue, with the Center of Medication Safety Advancement. And worked in that capacity in a very, very broad sense across medication safety in institutions, in people's homes, in education, so lots of different areas, and primarily for me, my specifically was also involved with the VAs around the country, and then as a part of the College of Pharmacy. A program called Boiler Works. It kind of meshes well with Purdue and boilers, but it's Boiler Works with all run together boiler and a capital W, then a small O and a capital R and a small X. That RX is that medication piece of that. But we did a lot of public health outreach at a time when the opioid epidemic had truly reached crisis proportions in the state of Indiana. This was around 2000. This was started right around 2017-18. And we did, and I was able to lead efforts really around the state in terms of outreach related to communities struggling with the opioid crisis and what it meant to the community. And every single community, it meant something different. So it meant that we needed to be able to facilitate conversations and to try to dispel myths and to try to address language. We all know words matter. Words are powerfully uplifting and they're powerfully destructive. And it was important to figure that out in the different communities.
So we're getting close to that stigma piece here as you talk about words and their strength and their effectiveness and how much damage they can do, whereas we can turn them in a more positive way and see a difference made as far as improvement goes. What do you see as the biggest stigma we're dealing with right now as far as our battle with substance use disorder and general conversation concerning that?
I would say that you hit the nail on the head when you use the word conversation. Because, frankly, the lack of willingness to talk about it gives stigma legs, gives stigma power. And part of a very important part of the work that we've done in the last 3 years that we'll be able to touch on, I think, yet this afternoon, in the grant work we did in Jay and Blackford counties, is to establish a theme of join the conversation. We found that even using the word stigma, we'd like to talk to you, or let's talk about stigma and the power that has, was stigmatizing in itself. Sometimes created a barrier in and of itself to having a conversation with people in business, with folks in law enforcement, with folks in the judicial system, with folks that were just seeking some kind of help. Stigma itself has become somewhat of a barrier in using that word. And we really found that it was easier to say, join the conversation. Let's have a conversation. Let's just talk about the issues that you're dealing with as a person, you're dealing with as a company, as an HR department in a company. But let's have a conversation and see where it leads us. So in some ways, stigma has become its own worst enemy, which may seem obvious to begin with. But if you can't talk about how words matter, if you can't get over that barrier into a conversation, then we can't find a path.
That conversation allows me to be me and you to be you instead of putting a barrier on it by using the word stigma, because we immediately connect with the word, I do anyway, negativity when we deal with the word stigma. But conversation allows me to speak my mind, my heart, my understanding, and for you to do the same and to see where that will take us, that common ground that we have, and to work from that.
I think that's so true. And I think, as you indicated, when that word stigma, all of a sudden, frequently people feel like they have to take a side. They have to be for something that you're talking about or against something you're talking about. So already you're setting up from the very beginning somewhat of a battle, somewhat of an adversarial relationship, because people feel as though they need to make a choice. So whereas intellectually, I know that stigma, that term stigma, and the actuality of the existence of the experience of stigma is very, very real. It still is very difficult to find a conversation around that reality. And until we have a conversation about what's real to somebody else's reality, then it's hard to understand, like I said, what kind of a path to take. Whether you're taking a path alone, or whether or not you get to take a path with somebody else.
Let's talk about the conversation that's come out of Jay and Blackford County. Let's talk about some of those discoveries, some of the effective tools you've been able to put together through that experience. Go ahead and share some of that with us, please.
Well, for a little background for everybody, we had the opportunity at Purdue, in partnership with a consortium of folks that live in Jay and Blackford counties, to put together a grant proposal that was funded by HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration, so a federal agency. But HRSA is very well known for a long history of work in rural communities in particular, and around health, and then more recently, over the past number of years, specifically in the opioid epidemic space as it relates and impacts health. So the grant was funded for 3 years. And it ended August 31st, just this past month, and started in September 21st, 2021, that would be. But what happened in that partnership, there was a consortium to begin with, and that consortium was purposefully drawn from different sectors of the communities. So represented in the consortium, A Better Life Brianna's Hope, the Blackford County Community Corrections, IU Health J Hospital, and at that time, IU Health Blackford Hospital, the J County Drug Prevention Coalition, and what started as Grant Blackford Mental Health, which evolved into Radiant, into Radiant Health Systems, and then Purdue. So that consortium, those folks each were identified leaders in this effort from those entities, and they became the consortium leadership. So we were representing two separate counties, multiple different kind of entities to begin with. But what we did that very first pretty much 9 months was to work very hard to figure out who do we need to talk to or who wants to talk to us. So all those consortium leadership folks gave us at Purdue, the leadership at Purdue for this grant, names, places, people that they thought we needed to talk to, introduce ourselves to, introduce the grant work to, and ask them to say, who else do we need to talk to from your perspective? Because we really wanted to build community stakeholders. And in that first community stakeholder event that we were able to bring folks together in person, remember now that COVID had impacted our plan that was funded tremendously because we were not in person to start with, for sure.
It impacted everything.
Sure did. Did not. I tell you, we would never know the extent of video and virtual work had it not been for COVID.
For sure.
But when we started being able to talk with folks face to face, when we brought everybody together initially that first time, there were 97 people that came to our first meeting and our first day-long workshop where we really tried to identify what's our starting point, what's our common ground. And frankly, it was about the need to develop resilient communities around the issue of breaking the cycle of multi-generational substance misuse and substance use disorder across the two counties, Jay and Blackford counties. And so we started off working on prevention and treatment and recovery efforts with two separate counties. And each county, what we called, had a table or a working group for prevention, treatment, and recovery efforts. And then there was a bridge table, that table that kind of crossed both counties with folks working kind of in the big picture. Well, by the end of almost a little more than 6 months, folks were saying, why would we work separately on this? We're working on the same thing. We got the same problems. We've just got different strengths and weaknesses. And we can work best and most productively by working together and leveraging each other's strengths to try to bolster up and build on some of the weaknesses that we've identified. So really, within about 9 months, that separateness was gone. And it was kind of a grassroots effort and recognition of the need to work together as a force multiplier.
I'm seeing that as a way of eliminating one of the stigmas. Regardless of any two counties, one feels this, the other one feels that. One has this strength, the other one has another strength. But to put those together, we're back into that conversation you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. And I think that the sort of the short story on the long effort of 3 years is there have been clear indications, and this goes a little bit to the academic university hat that I wear, in that one of the things that we have assessed formally over time with all the stakeholders in the community was this sense of connectedness. It's called a social network analysis by formal name. But what it does is that identifies just how connected and networked and trustworthy different people and agencies and entities in the community feel about one another, how often they interact, often they refer back and forth to one another. And so if you could just imagine in your mind that there are dots, and these are these agencies, these are these community workers, these are these businesses that work in the community and interact with one another. They're kind of dots, and they're connected by lines. They go this way and that. Well, there weren't that many lines when we started. But what we really see now is like somebody took a heck of a handful of spaghetti, tossed it at all those dots, and the spaghetti stuck. But now there are all sorts of lines that cross. It's a mess. And that's exactly what we're looking for. It looks like a mess. But if you were to blow it out, zoom out, so to speak, and see how everything is connected and the amount of referrals that go back and forth between and across the counties now, it's an amazing thing just to see. But it's an amazing thing to feel when you're in the room. When somebody says now in a room, I've got this problem and I can't seem to get, some folks that are in active recovery from point A to point B, or I can't seem to get somebody to see somebody when they're really ready. And then somebody else says, I can help you with that. Hey, let's talk a little bit more because I'm sure that I can make a connection for that individual for you. Across counties, across what used to be competitors, now these folks are absolutely working together. So we have really, the community, not we, the community really has evolved from a lot of competitiveness in a maybe less than productive manner into very much complementary interaction and networking and trust between one another, which is spilled over into the community of those that work in prevention, that work in treatment, and work in recovery.
I have been involved in the recovery community for about 10 years. And I remember back in the beginning, number one, you had to whisper much of what we're saying right now. The word stigma wasn't even developed or associated with drug use at that time. Substance use disorder, we didn't have those kind of labels. And I think that's where some of that competitiveness might be rooted. But now that we've come together, at least on some terms, we have a commonality to where I can speak to you, you can speak to me, we can have that conversation, and we know what we're talking about. There's multiple names for any number of drugs that we're
That's
talking about at this time. And once we get those, then we can do this together. We've got a question here. Let's go ahead. Eric, give us that question if you would, please.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, this is from Scott. He wants to know, what does the future look like?
That's a big question, but that's on my list as well,
question.
Scott. So we'll go ahead and we'll give that a little attention. Go ahead.
Sure.
Where do you think we're headed? What's it going to take to get there?
Oh, golly, conversation. We got to keep the doors open to be willing to listen and also to be willing to hear. We got to be good, active listeners when the conversation's happening. But, gosh, Scott, it seems as though you're probably hoping for a really specific answer. And I'm thinking really, really hard to be giving you a really good, specific answer right now. I will tell you that my world is a little bit siloed in when I think about prevention and I think about treatment and I think about recovery. And I think when you ask the question of where are we going, what does the future look like? I think it's different. I think it's really different now in all three of those areas, different from one another. But I think one of the biggest advantages to a path forward is the fact that in many cases now, schools are also a part of the conversation. It took so long to be able to develop enough of a trusting relationship to get into the schools for a conversation. And not only as a conversation, but to have folks in the schools that were in a position to be able to make some referrals and to make some actual connections but with families and with potential services that would be helpful. So I think the future, and I talk about that in terms of prevention. When I talk about kids for the most part, we talk about, I think in prevention and prevention opportunities. So, in that regard, I think we're moving forward. And as the schools are a more active part of the conversation, I see that there is more opportunity for productive intervention at younger and younger levels, because we do have problems at younger and younger levels. So I think that's important. When I think about treatment, I think about where are we headed in treatment. Frankly, goodness knows. There are a lot of options in treatment, and that's the key is options, because there is no one avenue for everybody when it comes to treatments. There are definite folks that feel a good connection with and a strong path that they feel comfortable with and supported with when we're talking about medications. There is a very strong path for folks that want any number of combinations with medications. And there are folks that feel that medications represent a way that they got into trouble. And they just can't have that conversation and can't feel confident that medications can be a part of their active and successful treatment path. So there are so many paths to recovery that now that also is a part of the conversation. The fact that there's no one treatment path for everybody.
If there was, we wouldn't be talking
We sure
about
would
this.
not.
We'd have that path down pat, and we'd be on it.
And it wiggles. It wiggles, and it goes up and down. And the
Constant flux.
big piece of being, I believe, not ever having been in recovery myself, total transparency, but I believe wholeheartedly that you have to trust that there's some safety net there that is woven tightly enough that you're not likely to fall through it. So you have to maintain your own sense of resiliency, belief, faith, that you can move. There's a way to move forward. So, treatment certainly bleeds into recovery that way.
What do you see, Cathy? I'll just kind of piggyback off of Scott's question there. What do you see as the biggest steps we have taken at this point? What is it that's moved us to the good we have? And I know there's much more to accomplish. This is not a destination that we've reached, but what have we done right to get where we are?
Well, I think part of what has happened is there has been a fairly significant. I'm talking a little. I'm not talking about just Jay and Blackford here, but in general, that there has been movement towards the recognition that manufacturing hiring of folks in active recovery is the right thing to do. That in itself, we've got a lot of work to do there, for sure. But there has been quite a significant amount of progress from my perspective in that avenue, in that the realization that hiring folks that are in active recovery, that those are going to be some of your most dependable folks, and in that the desire to have an income, a source in which to put food on table, put roof over head, support family, strengthens family. When we strengthen individuals or family, we do strengthen community. When we strengthen community, we strengthen business. We strengthen economic stability across all sorts of settings. And so I think that has been something that has seen positive movement. There are still certainly some of those OSHA regulations and some of those problems that we get into, folks that are challenged when drug screening is a requirement still. But educating those folks about what that drug screen looks like, why it looks that way, what that means in terms of that person's stability in their employment for the good for the organization. So there still is education to be done, but the more that we get the tentacles, the people, the folks in place that can tell the story. Well, you know what? I used to be way against this, and it has really worked out amazingly well for me in my company or in my business. And I've got to tell you, I think it's worth taking those steps for others. So, again, Randy, where are we back to? Having a conversation.
Yes. I'm hearing conversation and education and a lot that you say there. And I'm thinking of the tide and just the picture when the tide goes out or goes in, it's touching all of the waters. As we build a positive tide of recovery, as you were saying, not only does it affect that individual, but it affects their family, it affects their work, it affects the community, and we're lifting everybody up at that time.
We are.
We've got to get into that conversation, put the stigma behind it, and move forward in that way. What's some of the biggest changes you've seen in the recovery world, in the effort?
Well, still experiencing some significant barriers. There has certainly been growth and movement toward recovery housing. That's been one of the biggest challenges, and there's movement in the recovery housing. When folks have been in recovery, have decided to go into a residential recovery program, for example, or if folks have dealt with incarceration or the legal system, which has generated a path in some ways to recovery for some folks. You know as well as I do, those are the very riskiest times that those folks are going to face when they are taking those next steps out of that structured environment back into an environment for which probably there's no immediate safety net. The likelihood is that folks are going to gravitate back to an environment in which they knew. That was an environment in which they experienced some real challenging problems, in recovery and drug use, et cetera. And those are the most, they're the highest risks for an opioid overdose death. Not just an overdose, but an opioid overdose death. And so not having a place to go, not having a conduit, not having a soft handoff, a handshake with something, an environment that's going to be supportive, i.e., the ability to, move towards recovery housing, or move towards the supportive, and a supportive environment right out of an immediate structure. And so what I've seen is so much more of an effort towards recovery housing. It's definitely slow, but it is absolutely happening in the state of Indiana. It's happening outside of the state of Indiana. There, success sort of breeds success. One successful effort in being able to establish recovery housing successfully in a setting that was maybe contentious to start with that setting. But in order to get over those humps, people had open forums, had open conversations, had testimonies from other areas. It's hard to trust somebody that comes from outside your community and tells their story, because it's easy to say, well, your situation is not the same as ours. So in recovery, what I see is two things: the movement towards improving access towards recovery housing, but also the movement towards, the opportunities for folks to sustain a successful recovery.
So if resources were no problem, that includes money, that includes the leadership that you need. If that was no problem, I had a magic lantern, I could provide that for you. How would you want to use that?
Oh gosh, Randy, what a loaded question. How would I want to use that? I think probably would be to start to develop a groundswell of resources that would be able to help people identify how you speak the truth. And frankly, I come from an academic background, and what I see as an example, let's say Purdue's extension. There's a great connection to an academic and ground roots connection there. So if you take what the resources are in terms of some subject matter expertise that the university brings, and we could then farm that out, so to speak, to communities and help those communities develop the groundswell, the connectedness, the infrastructure that connects those folks in each community to develop what I called that safety net that's tightly woven. That's lots of people and agencies and organizations coming together so that and I'm a talker with my hands. And so to me, when I think about a safety net, that kind of starts like a net, a fisherman's net. And that's pretty loose. A lot of the small fish get lost in that. The big fish kind of stay. But what I see is weaving that tighter and tighter and tighter, that you see a basket weave, that people can weave a basket that essentially they can carry sand in that basket and lose very few small grains along the way. And what I have seen as being successful, and when I talk about subject matter experts, when I talk about folks that I tap on in the College of Pharmacy, they're experts in medication treatment for substance use disorders in particular. I talk about the people that are experts in public health. I talk about the folks that are experts in social services, experts in communications, experts in healthcare, experts in putting processes together. The group I work with at Purdue specifically called Health Tap. Now, they're subject matter experts in helping communities develop their own processes to apply to identified problems that the community's identified. So that takes a lot of money. takes a lot of money to mobilize that kind of time and to be able to free up that kind of time in the communities. But what you develop out of that is that social networking, that trust, those resources that aren't available just from 8 to 4 or 8 to 5, but they're available, from 11 to 11. They're available from 4 a.m. to a little bit later. So in that regard, it is so effective in developing this tightly woven safety net. But it takes a lot of resources. But that mobilizes prevention, treatment, and recovery.
Let's, as we start to wrap this up, I want to kind of give you that same question toward communities. So what is the advice you would give small community leadership that's listening to us right now for them to be able to take the next step in helping their folks with this recovery battle?
Well, unfortunately, Randy, like you touched on with your question about if you had unlimited resources, we don't. That's the problem. But community leadership typically knows where there might be a resource. And being community leaders then can be the force multipliers by knowing the various smaller pockets of resources. They can force multiply that by trying to bring those resources together, having that conversation together, always including everyone, not a conversation between just community leaders, but a conversation that includes those folks that are directly involved in providing care and recovery support or treatment support along the way, and those in active recovery. That conversation cannot ever be complete and move towards an understood direction of supporting recovery unless everybody's at the table and hearing the same thing at the same time. But once community leaders identify those smaller pockets of resources, and sometimes resources and assets, it's not only money. It's those folks that say, hey, my conference room can be open to you anytime you need it. Hey, I always mobilize in my business a volunteer day. How can our volunteer day help this asset? What can it be? How can it be an asset to the cause? So it's not only always money, but it's identifying what you're resource rich in that can be an asset to the effort. And leadership, being willing to have and start that conversation, though, empowers other folks to step up, step out, step forward. So I think community leadership is really holds so much power that's not just embedded in money. It's not just embedded in local or appointed office, and it's not just embedded in authority.
It's much more than political.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Much more. Let's kind of wrap this up here. I feel like we can put the entirety of our focus on the word conversation.
That's what
I'm so thankful you explained that during all of this and given us that option. But thank you. Thank you for the work you've done in Jay and Blackford, and I'm sure other places, Purdue as well. Carry some pride in Purdue. Our son's a graduate of there. The engineering department, nothing to do with what we've talked about. But I appreciate the school, what you guys have done for our community. It's meant a lot, and it'll continue to, and I'm sure it's spilled over into others.
Purdue has enabled me to do much of this work, and I'm very, very grateful. And I'm grateful for the opportunity, but I'm very hopeful. I am very hopeful
hear that
about
in your voice and your thoughts.
Absolutely, I am hopeful, and those that are listening to us, I hope also never lose sight of being hopeful.
I think the idea of hopefulness defeats that word stigma, stands above it, and rises well beyond it. Thank you. thank you for your time, your trip here today, your energy and what you've shared with us and all that you've provided us.
It's
God
truly been
bless.
my pleasure.
Well, it's been wonderful to have you folks. As always, our final words are stay in the battle and bring somebody else along and converse with them as you're going. Thank you for tuning in. God bless. Take care.